Fairies were never cute. Plot twist, they were never cute and never kind and typically never safe and also never straight. Before Disney wings and magic wands, fairies were often dangerous, seductive, gender-breaking beings who lived outside of human rules, and that is exactly why they have been queer-coded for centuries. Today, we are talking about the symbolism of queer fairies in folklore, how those myths evolved, and why modern fantasy, especially queer fantasy, keeps going back to fairies again and again. Hey there, I'm Cassidy Dwelis, fantasy author, folklore nerd, and professional enjoyer of stories with myth. If you're new here, I make videos about myth, queerness, storytelling, and how all of that shows up in modern books. And today's topic is one of my favorites because it sits right at the intersection of folklore, gender, and glorious rebellion. So let's talk about Fae. Everybody seemed to really enjoy the video that I made about demons, so I figured why not touch on something that is also equally enjoyed and also very prevalent in modern fantasy, especially romantasy today, Fae folk. In early Celtic folklore, fairies, fae, or the fair folk weren't tiny little winged creatures. They were liminal beings, so to speak. They lived between worlds, between life and death, between nature and humanity. In Irish and Scottish folklore, as well as similar beings all across Europe, were powerful, unpredictable, and deeply tied to the land. They dole out blessings, curses, or they just might steal you away forever, which is equally just as horrifying. What's important here is that Fae are not bound by human rules. They don't really have any morals, social structure, or gender identities. They exist outside of those binaries, and that's where the queerness starts. Many fairy beings from as far west as the UK and as far east as China are often described as shapeshifters. They're able to change their form, sex, or appearance as well. Androgynous, agender, beautiful, unsettling, impossible to categorize, and sometimes fairies' lovers and their sex changes depending on circumstance. Most of them just don't care. In folklore studies, this ambiguity is often interpreted as largely symbolic. The fairy folk represent what society cannot comfortably name. Sound familiar? Queer identity historically has often existed in that same liminal space. Unnamed, unsanctioned, whispered about rather than actually defined. The Fae aren't men or women in the strict binary sense. They're often something other, and that otherness makes them both dangerous and alluring. Obviously, fairy romantasy is very popular right now, and one of the most consistent tropes is this. Humans fall in love with the Fae, and then it never ends normally. It gets freaky, okay? You get stories of mortals whisked away into fairy realms, they lose time, they lose names, and ultimately they may lose themselves. These stories weren't just fantasy, they were typically moral allegories, which is where things get really interesting. Historically, forbidden love stories often stood for some kind of taboo desire, same-sex love, non-normative gender expression, or relationships outside of social expectations had to be coded indirectly. So, fairy lovers became a metaphor. There's a whole reason that there's an entire word for being gay and how some gay men obviously identify as fairies. You know, that's a very obvious and on-the-nose thing. The Fae are irresistibly attractive, socially forbidden, dangerous to love, impossible to domesticate, which, yeah, that maps pretty cleanly into how queer desire was framed and is still framed today. Some people obviously take offense to certain terms like being called a fairy in the LGBTQ+ community, but other people are embracing it wholeheartedly, which is where we get the fairycore aesthetic and people really embracing the magic and the gender ambiguity and the almost kind of fun, off-putting, and uncomfortable nature of the fairy aesthetic, which I absolutely love. So whether you choose to use that kind of a term or not, it's not necessarily a slur. Some people may not like it, but ultimately the romance community, especially in terms of books, has been embracing that kind of an identity, especially for more effeminate male characters, which I think is pretty cool. Now, let's talk about changelings, one of the most haunting and creepy pieces of fairy folklore. A changeling is a child swapped by fairies. The human child disappears, replaced with something uncanny, strange, and wrong. Historically, this myth was used to explain disability, neurodivergent children who didn't conform, queer or gender non-conforming kids, etc. Effectively, if you were a baby and you were weird, you were accused of being a changeling, and sometimes that unfortunately resulted in the death of the child. And in retrospect, obviously, this is devastating. You know, the story says, this child isn't what we expected, so something else must have taken them. They're not human. And that's not subtle, but modern fantasy has kind of reclaimed this idea, turning changelings into protagonists rather than tragedies. They have become symbols of survival, difference, and hidden power. There are plenty of authors who have created either changeling characters or characters who are half fae and defying their ancestry, and that can be really empowering. Modern fantasy writers, especially queer ones, have taken these old symbols and flipped them on their heads. Now the Fae are gender fluid, queer-coded, morally complex, sensual but not villainized, powerful without apology. They aren't punishments anymore. They're the protagonists. This reclamation says something very important. What folklore once framed as dangerous becomes, in modern storytelling, identity and agency, and that's why fairy stories resonate so strongly today, especially with queer readers. They're about finding power in the in-between, and mostly about choosing your own rules. Obviously, if you like fairy fiction, you're probably very familiar with A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, but I also want to talk about a couple of other pieces of fairy lit that I really like that I don't think get as much coverage because they're indie books. The first one that I want to talk about is The Dreamer and the Marked by Airic Fenn. I know this author personally. They are very, very cool. They themselves are a non-binary author, and they write a lot about fairy politics, so if that's something that you're interested in, definitely check them out. I would also recommend this book here, and while it doesn't have to do with fairies specifically, this is the Humane Society for Creatures and Cryptids. It has a lot of folklore in it and LGBT representation. It's by Stephanie Gillis. I did the book cover for this one, but this is another indie author that I think really deserves your love and support. And of course, I love fairies and folklore too, so this is exactly why I wrote the Braidy von Althuis series the way that I did. These books blend Slavic and Celtic folklore, including fairy traditions, djinn and mythic beings, Barghest being a big one, Mavki, Rusalki, lots of fun stuff going on in here. Magic is strange, the world is beautiful, and also fairyhood is deeply tied to identity. There isn't good or evil creatures, it's often about misunderstandings and learning to live with magic. The main takeaway is learning to live with things that make you uncomfortable rather than fearing them. And they're middle grade books, but adults love them too, because folklore hits different when you realize how much of it was always about being othered, so to speak. All 5 books are award-winning, and if you love fairy lore, liminal magic, and stories that treat myth with a lot of reverence but also offer fresh perspectives on things that you may already know or new myths that you don't know, these might be for you. The links to purchase all 5 of them are in the description, and I would love if you checked them out. So read myths from all different countries and from all over the place, because it was kind of surprising to me as somebody who was doing a lot of research from all over the place for the Braidy books when I first wrote them a couple years ago, how diverse fairies are, but also how they all kind of carry the same theme. Like, we were all thinking the same thing, whether you're talking about Chinese fairies or African fairy adjacent folklore figures, or even demons, so to speak, like Chorobash in Slavic mythology, or of course, less traditional fairies like Slua from Celtic mythology. They all have their own different flair and are all different social commentaries on a bunch of different things that we are still going through as humanity, which may be why we like the myths so much. It's an easy thing for us to connect to because it still applies. Humans are still human, we are still weird, and fairies are still relevant. So I think that that's really cool, and it gives us a kind of a cool touch point to connect to the past and also to be able to tell stories into the future about our queerness and about our otherness. Fairies have always lived in the margins, between worlds, between rules, and between definitions, and that's why queer readers and writers keep just telling their stories. So if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like, subscribe, and let me know which mythological creature I should cover next. You can also check the description for a fairy-filled mini reading list if you want to check out both indie titles and popular titles that contain queer fairies. So until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and don't step in the fairy circles, okay? I know it's tempting to go dance in the middle of the mushroom ring, but unless you want to lose your name or get swapped with a changeling, just don't mess with them. Leave the fairies alone.